and welcome to Altitude. My name is Fran Slater and I'm absolutely delighted to be back hosting again this month. Now, the 6th of June will mark the 80th anniversary of D-Day, the Allied invasion of Western Europe during the Second World War, and certainly one of the most pivotal days in human history. I think most people will probably be familiar with the D-Day landings in Normandy, but perhaps fewer would know the story behind the beaches and perhaps even above the beaches, you might say. And with me today to tell at least a part of that story are Dave Gilbert from the International Bomber Command Centre and Heathrow controller Adam Spink. Dave and Adam, hello to you both and a very warm welcome to Altitude.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Hi, Fran.
Now, don't forget that you can submit your questions to us today for Dave and Adam at any time during this show. We'll try and get to as many as we can later on for you, and we'll try and get through as much as we can today. I think we could probably do about 6 hours on this show, but we're limited, so we won't do that. So let's start with a bit of an introduction. So, Adam, start by telling us about yourself and why you're here.
Yeah, thanks, Fran. As you said, I'm an air traffic controller at Heathrow Tower. I've been there now for 25 years. I'm a history geek. So I'm really looking forward to looking and seeing what Dave has to explain today on this show. But also as part of my job, I work on radar systems in terms of developing procedures about how we use them and work with our European sort of colleagues on those systems in working groups. So yeah, looking forward to hearing what Dave has to say and like the principles of radar and how to manipulate it.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And I think, the fact that so much of what happened back then links to what we still do today is a really fascinating thing to me. But, again, I've been in air traffic a long time, but there you go. So, Dave, tell me about you. Tell us about your work and tell us about the International Bomber Command Centre in Lincoln as well.
Okay, so my name's Dave Gilbert and I'm a trustee and also the losses archivist at the International Bomber Command Centre in Lincoln. Now, the centre is a multi-award winning memorial and visitor centre, and it's dedicated to the 125,000 men and women of Bomber Command, almost 58,000 of whom paid the ultimate price. Now, many of you may have seen the Bomber Command Memorial in Green Park. Ours is really very different in that it is the only memorial in the world that names every single one of the losses, almost 58,000 of them, and that's my job as losses archivist. So I have to capture the names, and one of the most important aspects to get across is that we concentrate on the human aspect of Bomber Command. It's not about wrecks. We don't have any aircraft parts or anything of that kind. It's entirely about the human story of Bomber Command.
Wow, yeah, and I think it's definitely going to be well worth a visit. I'm definitely putting it on my list for when I can. So we're here today to talk about the background to D-Day and particularly kind of the aerial side of D-Day as much as the landings on the beaches. So can you give me some kind of sense of scale of the aerial operation and how it was planned and coordinated and kind of how it went from there?
Do you want me to do that?
Yeah, go first, Dave.
Okay, so approximately 11,500 aircraft were available on the day for all types of operation. But I think it's probably quite important to say that there was a huge effort in the run-up to D-Day that was perhaps not immediately apparent to soften up the French landing sites and make a landing even possible. And there were numerous operations that were intended to, quite early in the process actually, that were intended to destroy the Germans' ability to even make aircraft, so that there couldn't be any significant opposition. Also, there was the transportation plan, which is really crucially important to the whole thing, because what it chose to do was to cut off the supply lines to the beaches area, so that supplies of troops and ammunition and so on couldn't take place once the landings had happened. So all of that was going on in the days, weeks, and months prior to D-Day in order just to make it possible. But on the day itself, there was an awful lot of activity going on in all sorts of different ways. Some of it was before the landings, and I'll say a bit about that in a moment. But of course, once the landings had occurred and the cat was out the bag, then that's when huge numbers of troops could be, paratroops could be moved over and dropped by parachute. So it was those 11,000 aircraft were doing multiple missions on D-Day itself. So a huge amount of effort going on once the cat was out the bag. But now is maybe a good time to play a little bit of a video which kind of sets the scene on some of the deception that went on prior to the beach landings, most of which involved Bomber Command aircraft. So here we go with it now. So the first operation that was very important was one called Operations Taxable and Glimmer. Actually, two separate operations, both of which worked in exactly the same way. Basically, what happened was there was two squadrons of Bomber Command aircraft that moved in progressive circles. If I start the process now, you'll see the animation where the aircraft went round in circles, and during the forward part of their circle, they would drop something called window, which we'll speak a bit more about in a moment. What that did was to reflect the radar. And they did it in progressive circles like this, so that they could the movement of these clouds of reflective foil moved at the same speed as some shipping. And there was only a small amount of shipping. They were just small craft, let's say, and they moved at the same speed as these clouds of deceptive reflective stuff, and they carried behind them what looks on screen like balloons. In fact, that's exactly what they were. They were radar reflective balloons. They were called filberts, in fact, and they could reflect the enemy radar back to them, and each one of them looked like a 10,000-ton ship. Okay, once they reached somewhere close to the beaches, then the aircraft were gone by now, and in the last couple of miles of that transit, they were laying a smoke screen, and of course it's still dark at this point. And then, out of loud hailers, they started to play the sounds that would have been typical for a large fleet. You know, clanging sounds and chains and into loud hailers, this kind of thing, to try and make it seem like that's what was that this was where the landing grounds were. Now, the way I've shown it on screen, it isn't supposed to be geographic. It was just in a vertical line to demonstrate what the way in which Taxable and Glimmer worked. In actual fact, they took place in these two places here. 617, the famous Dambuster Squadron, did Operation Taxable, and 218 Gold Coast Squadron did the Glimmer operation. But they were very much the same. Theory was exactly the same, which was to reflect the enemy radar, make it seem like there was a huge flotilla of craft going along those two red bands that you can see on the screen there, so that was apparently where the landings were going to occur, when in fact, of course, they were happening on the 5 beaches that are shown there in yellow. Alongside that, there was also a thing called ABC, Airborne Cigar, it stands for. Long story, which we haven't got time for today. But this was a jamming technique, and again, Bomber Command aircraft, and they operated in the region between Taxable and Glimmer, and the purpose of them was to be able to jam enemy radio signals, so that night fighters couldn't be communicated with by their ground controllers. And it was one particular squadron, 101 Squadron, based here in Lincolnshire, that did all of that. And they had a specialist radio fitted to them, top secret, and they were manned by fluent German speakers, often German Jews, actually, so that they could come onto the intercom and speak over the ground controller. And give false signals as to what the night fighters should do. So that was the ABC operation. We've then got Operation Titanic, and what it did was to drop troops behind the beaches. There you go, by parachute. And that used a thing called Rebecca and Eureka, which we can come on to in a little while.
Yeah, we'll talk about those in a minute.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is really just a scene setter. And then when it came to the actual invasion force, that was between the Titanic area and taxable area. And it used a radio screen called Mandrel. And again, aircraft going around in a circle, moving at much the same speed as the actual invasion force in order to mask it from the German radar, so that its approach was effectively invisible. And then once they are close to the landing beaches, then they go back to base, leaving the flotilla actually right on the beaches. Okay, so that's just a scene setter, just to enable further discussion.
Wow, there was such a huge amount going on that day, wasn't there? Adam, tell me a little bit about the technology at the time, because, you know, so I think about that and I think about the radar screens that we use today and the things that we can see. And, you know, you'd like to hope we'd know all of that was going on. Whereas, but back then, I think things were only just developing. So what was air traffic control like at that time, and how did that compare?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, the radar was developed, you know, in the lead up to the Second World War by a few countries simultaneously. Britain and Germany sort of were developing it in parallel without really much knowledge of each other's programs. Of course, we've had altitude shows about the origins of air traffic control at Croydon Airport back in the interwar period. So what we would consider air traffic control was still mainly non-radar based, I would say, in World War II. Obviously, it's the geographical scope of the Second World War, certainly around the UK, is that most of the aerial, if not all aerial operations, were military based. So radar was definitely used in terms of identifying aircraft coming into UK airspace, and identify whether they were hostile or friendlies. And one of the main parts of that was something that was called identification friend or foe, so IFF, which is sort of what we still use today in terms of transponders. So we still have aircraft flying around today, and we see it on our flight radar tracking apps, that the ground station will send a signal out into the air. Equipment on each aircraft will receive that, send back a coded signal. Now we can see the speed, the height, you know, what the flight crew had for breakfast, etc. on our apps. But back in the Second World War, it was basically they're sending us the correct coded signal, so we know they are friendly aircraft, RAF or United States Army Air Force or whatever. If they're not sending back that code, then we know they're identified. We might need to, you know, scramble some night fighters or day fighters, regardless of, or, you know, depending on what time of day it was. And I think certainly, you know, something like D-Day with, as Dave said, the sheer amount of aircraft operations on that sort of 24-hour period, you know, certainly you can draw parallels of having to deconflict airspace. So the Operation Titanic that Dave talked about dropping the parachute troops behind the beaches, they came down sort of the Cherbourg Peninsula, so they didn't fly over the invasion fleet. They didn't fly, so there was a lot of deconfliction going on to make sure that everybody knew their own jobs and knew not to stray into another bit of airspace that was being used for something else. And it's sort of similar in how we design airspace use today. We get a lot more utility through developing flows through airspace, one-way airways, and so a lot of the concepts that were sort of almost developed for D-Day and operations similar to that, we still use today. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you know, for a bit of context, I mean, I don't think we've had figures for this year yet, but certainly our busiest record day back in 2019 had, you know, slightly more than 8,700 flights, I think. But as Dave was saying earlier, I mean, there were about 11,500 flying that day. I think you said, Dave, and they did about 14,000 and something sorties. So, I mean, that's just an incredible number when you think what's flying in the skies today, that actually we probably did almost double that on D-Day with very different kit for what was going on. So, you know, given the scale of that operation, you've obviously really got to be really precise about where you're going. So how did we make sure they were doing exactly what they needed to do and going where they needed to go?
So yeah, there were the various technologies sort of that were developed, either immediately pre-war and into the Second World War. So a lot of the aircraft were using navigation aids that have some relatively strange names. There was one called Oboe, where the aircraft would be transmitting signals and then picking up effectively another retransmitted signal from the ground. They would be able to determine their location quite precisely. There was something called, you know, Dave mentioned it just now about Eureka and Rebecca. So the idea of a main parachute drop was you would send what we call pathfinders into the drop zone where you wanted a few hundred parachutists to drop in. You would send in a group of 5 or 6 or a handful of pathfinder paratroops in, and they would have what was then called a Eureka beacon on in one of their backpacks. Now, you don't want these parachutes to be sending light signals out or transmitting something that could be detected, because obviously they're trying to be covert at this point. So you fit the transmitter in the transport aircraft that's bringing in the main drop of parachutes, and they'll transmit from the aircraft, and then they'll, with what's called a Rebecca beacon in the aircraft, and the Eureka beacon set up at the drop zone on the ground will listen and hear that signal and then retransmit back to the aircraft, so then the aircraft can determine where exactly to drop these the paratroops. And even though there was this technology, a lot of the parachutes ended up a few miles away from their intended drop zones. So I think being a paratrooper on the June the 5th into June the 6th would have been quite a chaotic thing to be, given that you could have been dropped 5-10 miles away from your drop zone, because the winds were quite strong on that night and relatively unforecast, I think.
If I can perhaps just add at that point, one of the factors about Rebecca and Eureka was that it didn't work at very close range. The final 2 miles had to be done by sight, and the problem is, in the heat of the battle and in that moment, all the pilot wants to do is get the paratroops out. And so actually you could very easily panic in that last moment, tell them to jump, and you end up 2 miles from where you should be. And 2 miles is a lot when you're on foot.
Yeah, it's going to take quite a bit of time, isn't it? So, Dave, you told us a little bit then about Mandrel and Glimmer and Taxable, because that was all the kind of the idea was to deceive the Germans into thinking that we were going to be somewhere other than where we actually were. So how successful was that? Did that work?
Well, it wasn't really about fooling them to the point where they would take. They would move troops to that zone. That was never really a likelihood. It was about sowing confusion, and in that respect, it was very successful. Taxable was not especially successful. Nobody really knows why, but Glimmer was very successful, it actually operated at multiple levels, because when they dropped these window, as it was called, or chaff as it would be called these days, there were actually multiple different types of window or chaff that they were dropping. And it's not just bits of silver paper. We're not talking about dropping any old Kit Kat wrapper and it'll be fine. These were very, very specific, and I've actually got one here. It's a reproduction. It's not the real deal. So the Germans used a radar system called Freya, and the wavelength, the frequency it operated at had a wavelength of 54 centimeters. It turns out that if you want to reflect the maximum amount of signal And let's face it, that is what you want, because you want to be able to completely fog the received signal to the point where it looks like it becomes so confusing on the radar screens that it's completely unusable. Then turns out that half a wavelength, i.e. 27 centimeters, is exactly what you need. And we've got a little bit of VT, which hopefully we can run right now, which explains why. Let me just first explain why this matters. When you hit half a wavelength, then what happens is it becomes resonant, and it reflects the maximum amount of energy back to the receiving device, the radar, and that it's very accurately controlled. If I was to just even cut off 5 centimeters, it would make a huge difference, because it would no longer be resonant. So this video that I'm about to run is an analogy, and what I'm doing is reproducing the idea of resonance using, quite literally, a bucket of water and a pipe. Now, when you see it, I'm not going to speak over it, because you need to listen, because I'm using audio as an analogy here. What I do is I drop the pipe into the bucket of water. And as I do that, of course, the water comes up inside the pipe and creates a chamber of a given size. As I move the pipe up and down, the size of that chamber varies. And what I then do is I hold a loudspeaker over it, which you'll barely be able to hear for a start. But as I move the pipe up, and in doing so make the chamber longer, at a precise moment, I will hit that point of resonance, and you'll hear it gets very much louder, very suddenly. And then as I go a little bit further, it drops off again. So if we perhaps run that VT now, then hopefully you can, and I'll stay quiet, and then hopefully you can hear the effect of that resonance.
Wow.
Okay.
So for the less technologically minded of us then, so the idea of that was to sort of create a distraction or stop the signals being received by the Germans. Is that the idea of it?
The idea was to choose the length of this stuff very carefully, so that it reflected the maximum amount of the signal, and that would happen at that resonant point. And with the resonant point is when it's exactly 27 centimeters long. Okay, so this is a life-size piece of what window actually looked like, and they were dropped in huge bundles out of the aircraft, literally millions of these, to create this reflective pattern, so that the Freya radar back on the French coast was so overwhelmed by the size of the return signal that it couldn't cope and couldn't give any sensible signal. It just looked like a cloud of reflection, and in doing so, try to confuse the enemy radar. It wasn't really about trying to fool them that the invasion was taking place in a different location. That wasn't really what it was about. It was just about sowing as much confusion as possible and making their equipment effectively, ineffective actually.
Yeah, so their sense of confusion and what's happening and what's real and what's not, and what they could trace was then, contributing to their response, or their hopeful lack of response to what was going on with the landings. And Adam, I know, so someone told me I need to ask about Rupert. So tell me about Rupert, because that contributes to it too, I believe.
Yeah, so a lot of the operations, as Dave said, were more about sowing confusion. And I don't think if you're a German sentry in the early hours of the 6th of June in Normandy somewhere, seeing paratroopers drop out of the sky and then hearing gunshots and seeing, explosions, that would probably be quite confusing to you, especially when you find out that the source of all this commotion is actually a straw man about 2.5 feet tall. And basically, that's what a Rupert was. There were 500 of these developed and dropped on the D-Day, in the early hours of D-Day, and basically that's the idea, is to confuse the Germans as to where the main attack is coming. So bearing in mind, there are also, paratroopers being dropped themselves and causing explosions and firing their guns and attacking strong points and holding bridges, etc. But there are also lots of these Ruperts dropped, and yeah, it was to sow confusion. If you were a German commander having a report from one person saying, I'm being attacked by paratroopers, there's gunfire, in the next field, but then a few minutes later you hear a report saying, oh no, it's just tape recordings in a straw dummy, you're not going to believe that, or are you? But then you get a phone call from somebody else saying, I am being attacked by paratroopers, we've taken a few prisoners. You're going to think, well, is that a diversionary raid? And then you don't know who to attack or where to defend. So yeah, the Ruperts were, I'm sure people watching this might have watched the film The Longest Day, and they're featured in there. And basically, yeah, straw stuffed dummies, some with tape recorders, some with effectively fireworks and flashbangs that would go off when they hit the ground. And if you think about it, in 2 a.m., 1 a.m. in the morning, it's dark, you've got a few searchlights going over, you see something that looks vaguely humanoid shaped coming down on a parachute, you're going to think it's real and you're going to react accordingly. And it's just buying the Allies, the British, Canadians, the Americans, and all the other sort of allied countries involved on that day, buying time to build up the troops onto the beaches and attack inland, make room for more reinforcements coming in. So it was all about gaining that foothold by a bit of misdirection. It's not about saying the invasion's here, not there, as Dave said. It's just sowing that level of confusion.
Interestingly, only the British call them Rupert. The Americans call them Oscar.
And hopefully you saw a picture of Rupert or Oscar on your screen earlier on with that one. So Adam, tell me then, what do you think most about now as a current controller? What about what happened, what those men and women did 80 years ago in terms of, air traffic control and the technology they were using and things? What parallels can we draw from what we do today? I know you talked a little about it earlier, but, what does it make you think and feel about those people then?
Firstly, obviously there's that first emotion of just awe and amazement about what they did, and just that generation in total went through, and all the people who did pay the ultimate sacrifice, so that we're free to sit on in our homes today and talk about this sort of thing. But I guess the other thing, as I said, there's the sort of the concepts that were developed in this operation and others similar to it throughout the war about deconflicting airspace. And then I think the other thing is just the amount of planning that goes into something like this. The amount of thought, the amount of, somebody had to sit down, going back to Operation Taxable and Glimmer, somebody had to sit down and think, how can we make it look as if there's a convoy of ships heading towards Calais when there isn't? How many radar reflecting balloons do we need? How many aircraft and how often do they need to put out a bundle of window? And how long do they have to fly towards France before turning round? And then how long do they have to fly back towards England before turning round and replete to make it look as if they're heading towards France at 8 knots, which is what the speed of the transport ships, if they existed, would. So it's just all those level of, going to the nth level of, detail, and coming up with the planning. I'm sure, Fran, you've been in meetings, I'm sure I have as well, where we get frustrated with how much detail we have to provide to assure the changes in our current operation in air traffic control. And it's things like that make me think, well, yeah, okay, that's fair enough. We should go to this level of detail. And yeah, it's just that, that just they thought almost of everything.
Those real unsung heroes in the background who did all of that. Dave, we've had one of the questions come in already from Jackie to say, what was the silver material of window composed of? Was it aluminium foil? Was it silver? Did they try different things? Tell us.
All it needs to be is conductive. So it was just aluminium foil, but it was on a backing of, well, I've used sugar paper here, which is pretty much what they used, I think. And the idea of that was just to stiffen it, because since this 27 centimetre business is so important, then what you don't want is it folding up in the slipstream and effectively becoming only half that length. So it was simply a stiffener. And one of the nice stories is that these things adorned French Christmas trees throughout the late 1940s, because they were ideal for that. But the other thing is that the operation the Taxable and Glimmer operations didn't just drop foil strips like this, because they had to deceive multiple types of radar. Freya was one, and that's what these were all about. But there was another one which was was actually more important, in fact, because it was the shipping radar, which was called SeaTact. Now that used a lower frequency, which implies a longer piece of foil, and in fact, way too long. It would be a couple of meters or something like that. Too long to be foil. It would just fold up in slipstream. So in that case, they used a thing called rope, and that was its code name, and it was, unsurprisingly, rope. But it was conductive rope. It was dipped in a graphite solution to make it electrically conductive, so that it had that reflective effect for that frequency of radar. And it was dropped on a parachute, so it would just drop vertically down, but albeit quite slowly. Drop from a low altitude so that it would seem like a flotilla of shipping.
Wow. So they really did think of everything, all sorts of different types. Wow. So Adam, we've had a question from Thomas saying, did the RAF radar stations have position indicator screens?
Some did, some didn't. So the sort of the radar system that was developed and sort of used for the first time in the Battle of Britain. So the sort of the more defensive radar system that was set up with what's called chain home and chain home low. They would, or certainly chain home, weren't using position indicator screens. So just to explain what I'm talking about here, position indicator screens are probably what you would think of, or planned position indicator screens is sometimes called, a screen with a center, a circular screen with a center with a radar sweep going around. You know, you often see them stylized in Hollywood movies, whereas the generation of radar that was developed for the Battle of Britain didn't have that sort of display to the controller, just had a linear, almost like oscilloscope display, and they could only determine range, and then you had to have a few radar stations determining the range from each station and then triangulating positions, etc., which is where you get to that sort of map table with the people pushing symbols around map tables,
pushing things down.
But as the war went on, sort of more efficient ways and rotating antenna, which is where you then get the link to a rotating display screen. So there were actually a few large landing ships within the convoys of transports going across to the Normandy beaches on the 6th of June that were fully kitted out as fighter direction ships. So they had their own radar systems, their own map plotting tables, their own display screens, and they were very capable of defending the local airspace around the Normandy beaches from the Luftwaffe. And they were the controllers on those ships were in contact with RAF fighter squadrons. So yeah, the ones in Normandy on the ships did have a position indicator, but there were also obviously some being used back in the UK that didn't.
That weren't. Yeah, so a real mix of technology.
Yeah.
We've had a question from David. I guess we'll come to Dave first with this, but both of you can answer. Did anything ever go wrong? Of course, things go wrong, but did anything ever go wrong at this particular one? And were there any mid-air collisions with so many aircraft flying in close proximity?
There weren't any from a bomber command point of view, but I think Adam, didn't you identify that there had been?
Yeah, I think there were 2 collisions in each involving 2 aircraft on the 6th of June, both actually American, or all 4 aircraft were American B-26 Marauder, which are twin-engine bombers. But I think a key, and Dave, you could probably speak to this, is in those days training was, you were taking your life in your hands just going into training. So I don't know whether you have any figures to hand in terms of any bomber command losses sort of just that occurred in training throughout the war.
Oh, yeah, they're very significant. So of the 58,000 names that there are on the memorial walls at our centre, nearly 9,000 were training losses. So they never flew an operation. It was, and that it didn't really get a whole lot better throughout the war. Actually, there were always an attrition rate during training. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, and people were going up with very minimal flying time, weren't they? That they'd hardly ever been in and been, put up in an aeroplane and away you go type thing.
Well, it depending on which trade as to how much training they got. Actually, pilots you'd usually had about 18 months training by the time they actually flew an operation for real. But in terms of D-Day itself, certainly the bomber command losses were actually surprisingly light. Even in that sort of 5-day period in the run-up to D-Day, by that time we had such air supremacy that there was very little opposition in actual fact, and that's where Operation Point Blank, which was the sort of the 6-month period prior to D-Day, had really rendered the Germans' ability to make aircraft and fuel them had rendered it completely inoperative. So because Bomber Command had been pounding the synthetic oil plants, the ball bearing factories, which allowed engines to be manufactured. These were sort of the pinch points for the German manufacturing systems, was fuel and bearings, and they were a big part of Operation Point Blank. So by then, we'd sort of almost eliminated the Luftwaffe as any credible threat in that area. So the losses were actually surprisingly light in the air, at least.
Okay. We had another question from Terry to say, how did they manage to conceal the manufacture of the material for Window? Was there a counter narrative about what they were doing? Where was it produced?
I don't know where it was produced, but it had been produced for a very long time before D-Day. So it was originally used, I think, in 1942, and everybody knew about it. The Germans were well aware of how easy it was to do this, and there was even at the beginning of the war, it would have been possible to have dropped Window, but that didn't happen. It was about 3 years in before it was first used, and it was first used by the British, and it was a bit of a reluctance, because as soon as one side started using it, you could guarantee that the others would too, and of course they did. So Window had been in production for a very long time, and what they used to do in sort of ordinary day-to-day attacks on, for example, German infrastructure, perhaps to the Ruhr Valley or something like that, they would drop bundles of it down the flare chute of the aircraft. But when it came to D-Day, they actually modified the aircraft. They took the cupola at the front of the aircraft, where the bomb aimer would normally lie. In this case, there was no bombs to drop, so you didn't need a bomb aimer. Instead, they took that cupola off and just dropped it out wholesale out the front of the aircraft. So as to where it was manufactured, I honestly don't know. No doubt numerous sites, because they would have, over the duration of the war, they would have dropped billions of these things.
Wow, yeah. That's quite amazing. So Adam, a couple of air traffic ones for you then. What do you think are the biggest differences between what an air traffic controller was doing then and what you do today? And how much of a connection can you draw from what they did 80 years ago with modern aviation?
So I think that, the first question is an interesting one, because in some ways my day job at Heathrow is so far. Obviously, the principles are the same.
Yeah.
You know, you try and keep aircraft apart, you deconflict them, and there's a rule set to allow you to achieve that. There are so many support tools and computers working alongside me, and I'm sure it's the same for you at Swanwick, the controllers at Swanwick, that there are so many alerting systems and safety systems working in the background to aid us in handling as much traffic as we do, as safely as we do. So that's certainly one thing where an air traffic controller from the late 30s, early 40s walking into Heathrow Tower or one of the ops rooms at Swanwick would be completely amazed about what we do. However, I work at the Royal International Air Tattoo as well in the control tower at RAF Fairford, and basically when I'm working there, I've got a radio, a pencil, a piece of paper, and a telephone, and that is exactly what the air traffic controllers back in those days would have been using at most of the airfields around. You know, the Bomber Command airfields up in Lincolnshire and Yorkshire. You know, the people in the control tower there were basically just using that, and they would immediately recognise the environment that I work in at RAF Fairford, and that most small, you know, grass airstrips around the country still use. So in some ways, in some areas it's changed dramatically. In others, it's almost exactly the same. That the pilots are working to a rule set of how you fly a circuit and who is number one and who goes away to who, and the controllers are working to that rule set as well. So it's, you know, there are very strong sort of continuation themes throughout, and I guess the connection, I think it goes back to that planning aspect. It goes back to you know, have we thought of everything? You know, one of my main tasks in my job at Heathrow, I work in the operations department, so I'm working on new procedures, new bits of equipment that to get introduced. You know, we always ask, what will go wrong? How will it go wrong? How often will it go wrong? Is it serious? If it goes wrong, how can we mitigate that? So it goes back to all that sort of pre-planning aspect as well, I think.
And that still definitely goes on at Swanwick as well. And again, like you say, I think we can go back to the kind of the basic first principles of those, how we keep planes apart. And, you know, in the old days, and certainly when I was training very long time ago, you still learned procedural air traffic control, which is about making sure that aircraft were either at different heights or reporting over different places at different times. Well, a lot of that's done electronically now, or we see things on radar. But that whole principle of making sure that we know where things are to make sure that we can avoid any conflict between the two of them is definitely there. So yeah, I completely see that everything has developed from there, but that initial start then was quite incredible. Martin says, is it true that you have some German battlefield binoculars in the tower at Heathrow, and if so, what do you use them for?
Yes, we do. I'm honest, I don't know where they came from, but they're certainly German, and they're certainly World War II vintage, and there are some photos, and I think the viewers are seeing a photo of them in the tower at Heathrow currently. And yeah, they're still very good, as you'd expect from a Carl Zeiss set of binoculars there. And they're quite heavy, quite cumbersome, because they would have been mounted on a big artillery rangefinder, or even I've seen pictures of the same set of binoculars being used in U-boats. But yeah, what do we use them for? If we want, well, without being facetious, to look a long way away. So if an aircraft's coming in that's in an emergency, we'll often get them out and focused on the aircraft, or if something's happening the other side of the airfield, which could be, you know, 1 or 2 miles away from us in the tower, we'll use them. But they're quite cumbersome and heavy to move around. So generally controllers will just grab the handheld binoculars that we're all familiar with.
Wow. We've had a lovely comment in from Hugh, who is a retired controller, he used to work at Prestwick Centre. I think he said at Prestwick Centre we had a controller who was in Bomber Command. Apparently he's still attending weekly dances at the local Rafa club, which is amazing. Beats the boys at snooker, and he's 106. And I think that's one of the things that's just so amazing. But I know as time marches on, and I know that's something we've thought about, that, you know, with this anniversary, we are getting to the point where the number of people who are alive who will still remember the actual events of this day is, you know, and everything that happened is are going to dwindle, aren't they? And that's you know, we need to learn as much as we can before we lose those people. And that's why I think it's really valuable that we have, you know, people who are so interested in the history and learn so much, and someone like Dave, like you know, creating what you do up at the International Bomber Command Centre to make sure that these things don't get forgotten, because I think that's, you know, it's such an important part of our history and the life that we lead today, which we definitely wouldn't be leading if things had gone differently. I think that makes such a difference. So yeah, any final reflections from you both on those people who gave that sacrifice, and, you know, whether it was the ultimate one or were still alive today, or you know, have died in the intervening years, and what happened sort of 80 years ago?
Well, I think I remain in awe at the tasks they did on a daily basis, let alone what they did on D-Day. It is quite incredible. And, you know, Winston Churchill always used to talk about the corkscrew thinkers, the people that created the technology that allowed us to create these deceptions that made it all possible. Because without them, it could never have happened, and not least in the way that D-Day was actually planned. Yeah, I remain in awe, and I expect always to be so.
And Adam, anything final from you?
Yeah, just I think echoing your thoughts, Fran, that you know, while we still have the dwindling number of veterans around from that time, you know, listen to what they have to say, and honour them for what they did, and just you know, go and visit the Bomber Command Centre up in Lincoln, and also for those of us in the south, I would also recommend the memorial in London, which is certainly very thought-provoking.
And I know there are lots of events around now to commemorate D-Day this year, so, you know, look out for those, and yeah, maybe take the time to make sure that you know more than you did when you started. And certainly I've very much found that today, and it's been really fascinating talking to you both and listening to you both. So thank you very much for educating me, as well as being really, you know, passionate about your subject. It's been lovely talking to you both. And I'm really sorry, but that is all we've got time for today. So a huge thank you to both Dave and Adam for their time today and their insights today, and thank you to you all for watching. It's definitely given me another perspective on, you know, the anniversary that's coming up, and I hope it has for you too. So in the meantime, the show will be available on demand on the Nats YouTube channel, as it usually is, as well as an audio podcast in all the usual places you can get those. Please keep an eye out on the social channels for details of the next show, and as ever, if you've got any other questions or any suggestions about topics that you think we should cover on Altitude, please do let us know. Thanks very much for listening today, and we'll hope to see you again soon. Take care.